In addition to parallelism, there are a number of other features of poetry which are somewhat different than what you find in Hebrew narrative. For example, there's a lot of use of word pairs. This kind of goes along quite a bit with parallelism if you've listened to that video. It is sort of makes up the structure of a lot of parallelism. For example, in this Psalm 49, 1 through 3, or in Hebrew, verses 2 through 4, things like hear, give ear, all you peoples, all inhabitants, are all pairs of words which will be either synonymous or they will be antithetic. They will give you a contrast. So low and poor is a word pair, high and rich. My mouth, my heart, wisdom, understanding. This is very, very common, and it is closely tied to the use of parallelism. It is good to give thanks, to sing praises. Our two word pairs, Lord, Most High, is another one. Steadfast love and faithfulness are pairs, morning and night. Something else is the use of what is called chiasm. Now, this is based on the Greek letter chi, which looks like an X. And it is called chiasm because basically the parts or the word pairs that are in a particular colon will switch word order. So here, the Lord knows the way of the righteous. So you have the verb and then the noun phrase. But in the second colon, you will have the way of the wicked will perish. So the word order is switched. And you have, if you connected them, you would have a line going this way, a line going that way, and that makes kind of an X, hence the Greek chi, which is the basis of the word chiasm. Here's another example. I called upon the Lord, so verb, and then prepositional phrase. Here, prepositional phrase, then verb. So the word order switches. Something else that is sometimes used is what is called an inclusio, where the psalm or the section of poetry begins and ends with the same statement. So in Psalm 8, it is, O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And you'll find that both at the beginning and the end. And it's a way of, it's kind of a literary feature, which reinforces then the beginning of the psalm. Something else that is a feature that is impossible to translate into English is called an acrostic. And in an acrostic, each successive line begins with a successive letter of the alphabet. You may have seen these in English. Here's the English version, and in Psalm 111, each of these lines in Hebrew begins with a successive letter of the alphabet. But of course, you can't translate that. It only really works in the Hebrew. So here, Psalm 111, you have the introduction, Hallelujah. Then you can see that this line begins with the Aleph, the next one the Beit, the Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, etc. It's a very lovely literary device, and it does not so much have semantic meaning, but it has to do with structure or form. If you've ever studied poetry, it's a little bit like the idea of a sonnet where you have a very particular structure that you're trying to adhere to, and it requires all of the skill of the poet in order for it to make sense. So here, the acrostic requires a lot of creativity and craft and poetic sensibility. But of course, you can't translate it into English. Hebrew poetry will also use a lot of figurative language, metaphoric language. You can see this in the largest sense in Psalm 23, which basically is entirely a metaphor with the Lord as the shepherd. And so everything pretty much in the psalm relates to this metaphor as saying what God is like. To get at the issue of the controversy over whether Hebrew has what is called meter, one can take a look at classical poetry. There are those who want to see meter in Hebrew poetry, and that is because it is extremely characteristic of ancient classical poetry and of quite a bit of English poetry as well. For example, what does that mean? So it is characteristic of Greek and Latin poetry that they used something called dactylic hexameter. And this involves what are called 6 feet, a long and 2 short syllables, or 2 long syllables. The kind of rhythm this gets can, for example, be seen in the Iliad of Homer in Greek. Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus, son, Achilles. So you can see there's sort of 6 thoughts or words or phrases that have a stress. Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus's son, Achilles. Okay, so that's 6 stresses. In the Aeneid, it is similar. Arma verumque cano, Troie qui primus ab oris. Okay, so it's 6 stresses. Arms and the man I sing, who, forced by fate. You also have in other kinds of poetry, for example, Japanese, you have what is called syllable counting. So there's a very specific number of syllables. In haiku, it is 17. So an old silent pond, that's 5. A frog jumps into the pond, 7. Splash, silence again, 5. And if you were like me when you were in elementary school, you made up your own haiku. In English, we have what is called iambic pentameter in certain kinds of poetry. Obviously not in modern 20th century poetry or 21st century poetry, but it used to be very common. So a group of 2 or 3 syllables referred to as a foot. And A line of iambic pentameter then consisted of 5 of these feet. When that April with his showers soot, it's 5, and pardon my pronunciation, the drought of March hath pierced to the root. Okay, so count 5 stresses. And bathed every vein in switch liquor, 5, of which vertu engendered is the flower. Or, as in John Milton's Paradise Lost, of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. So you can count, there's a sort of stress pattern of 5. So meter and rhythm in Hebrew. There probably is no set meter in Biblical Hebrew poetry, although there are those who will argue for it. Instead, there is something like rhythm, sound repetitions. And most lines have either 2 to 4 stresses, which is a lot more than, say, you would have in a verse of Hebrew narrative usually. Most lines within a parallelism tend to have the same number of stresses. One exception to this idea of meter is in the lament, and this is a 3-2 stress pattern. So in Lamentations 3:25, Tov Adonai lekavo, so it's 3 stresses. Lanafesh tidrashanu, 2 stresses. I have indicated this in the English by linking the translation with a hyphen to show you. So the Lord is one, is good is another, to those who wait for him is the third. In the second half of the verse, to the soul is one, that seeks him is another. So it does have this 3-2 stress pattern in lament. Otherwise, probably not.